Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Picture a man so large that his fellow students called him the dumb ox, so silent that his classmates thought him slow, and so brilliant that his teacher declared one day the bellowing of this ox will be heard throughout the world. Tonight we trace the extraordinary life of Thomas Aquinas, the medieval monk who reconciled faith and reason, who built a cathedral of thought that still stands 7 centuries later, who showed the Christian world that Aristotle the pagan could serve Christ the Saviour. This is the story of a nobleman's son who abandoned a castle for a monastery cell. It is the story of a mind so vast it could hold the entire cosmos, from the movements of angels to the price of bread, and find divine order in all of it. It is the story of a man who wrote more in his 49 years than most people could read in a lifetime, and who stopped writing 3 months before his death, declaring that everything he had written was like straw compared to what he had seen. Before we begin this journey into the medieval world of faith and philosophy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I am always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we travel to 13th century Italy, to a time when the greatest minds of Europe were monks, when universities were just being born, and when a single question, can reason lead to God, was worth devoting an entire life to answer. But to understand how Thomas Aquinas became the greatest theologian of the medieval church, we must first understand the world he was born into. A world of crusades and cathedral building, of ancient Greek manuscripts returning to Europe through Arabic translations, of a church at the height of its temporal power and facing the greatest intellectual crisis in its history. The Italy of the early 13th century was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of city-states, feudal territories, and papal lands locked in constant conflict. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope fought for supremacy over Christendom, a struggle that would define politics and culture for generations. The imperial party, the Ghibellines, claimed that temporal authority came from God through the emperor, independent of papal approval. The papal party, the Guelphs, insisted that all legitimate authority, even that of emperors and kings, derived ultimately from the Vicar of Christ. This was not merely theoretical debate. Cities align themselves with one faction or another, and these alignments determine trade relationships, military alliances, and the fate of families. In Florence, the Guelphs and Ghibellines fought street battles that turned neighbourhoods into fortresses. In Milan, imperial forces besieged papal supporters. In Rome itself, noble families maintained private armies and turned the city into a battleground. Noble families warred against each other in blood feuds that lasted generations, their origins sometimes lost to memory, but their violence perpetuated by honour and revenge. A slight to one's family demanded retaliation. That retaliation demanded counter-retaliation. The cycle continued year after year, consuming wealth and lives in conflicts that served no purpose beyond maintaining the fiction that family honour required blood payment. And the common people caught between these powers struggled to survive in a world where violence was never far away. Peasants working fields might see them trampled by warring armies. Merchants travelling between cities risked robbery or worse from bandits who claimed allegiance to this lord or that, but answered really only to their own greed. Even within city walls, safety was uncertain. Factional violence could erupt without warning, and the innocent died alongside the guilty. Yet this same violent age was producing some of the most sublime expressions of human spirituality and intellect. It was as if the chaos of daily life drove people to seek order and beauty in transcendent realms. The great Gothic cathedrals were rising across Europe, their soaring arches and brilliant stained glass windows designed to lift the human soul toward heaven. At Chartres, at Notre Dame in Paris, at Canterbury, master builders were creating spaces that seemed to defy gravity, where stone became lace and light itself became a sermon. The construction of a cathedral required generations. Masons, glaziers, sculptors, and labourers devoted their entire lives to building something they would never see completed. The investment of resources was staggering. Whole cities devoted a substantial portion of their wealth to these projects. But the result was architecture that proclaimed divine glory more eloquently than any preacher. Spaces designed to make the worshipper feel simultaneously humbled by God's majesty and elevated toward heavenly things. The first universities were being founded at Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, transforming education from monastic copying of ancient texts to rigorous intellectual inquiry. These institutions emerged from cathedral schools and guilds of masters, groups of teachers who attracted students and began organizing formal curricula. They received charters from popes or kings granting them autonomy, the right to award degrees, and protection from local authorities. At Bologna, the law faculty was developing sophisticated methods for interpreting Roman law and canon law, creating the legal framework that would govern Europe for centuries. At Oxford, scholars were beginning to emphasize empirical observation and mathematical analysis of natural phenomena. At Paris, the theological faculty was grappling with the most profound questions about God, creation, and salvation. These universities were creating the intellectual infrastructure of Western civilization, establishing patterns of inquiry and standards of argument that persist to this day. And into this world of contradiction, where brutality and beauty existed side by side, new ideas were arriving that would challenge everything the Christian Church thought it knew. Through Spain and Sicily, through the Muslim kingdoms that preserved and studied ancient learning, while Christian Europe had forgotten it, the works of Aristotle were returning to the West. Not the few logical treatises that medieval scholars already knew, but the complete corpus of Aristotelian philosophy. Physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology. An entire system of thought that explained the natural world without reference to divine revelation. The church authorities were terrified. Aristotle was a pagan who had lived 3 centuries before Christ. His philosophy seemed to make God unnecessary for understanding nature. His logic appeared to contradict Christian doctrine on the eternity of the world, the immortality of the soul, and divine providence. In 1210 and again in 1215, the University of Paris banned the teaching of Aristotle's natural philosophy. The ban was repeatedly renewed throughout the early 13th century, but the books kept circulating. Scholars kept reading. The questions Aristotle raised could not be silenced by ecclesiastical decree. The choice facing the church was stark. Reject Aristotle entirely and cede the realm of natural philosophy to those who might use it against faith, or find some way to reconcile this pagan wisdom with Christian truth. Into this crisis, in the year 1225, in the castle of Roccasecca in the kingdom of Sicily, a child was born who would do what the church thought impossible. They named him Thomas, and his life would become the bridge between Athens and Jerusalem, between reason and revelation, between Aristotle the philosopher and Christ the Redeemer. The castle of Roccasecca still stands today, its stone walls rising from the hillside overlooking the valley of the Liri River in central Italy. It was here, in the winter of 1225, that Theodora d'Aquino gave birth to her youngest son. The exact date is not recorded. Such precision was rarely considered important for anyone below royal rank, but it was likely sometime in late 1224 or early 1225. The child's father was Landulf of Aquino, a minor nobleman who held lands from both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Kingdom of Sicily. The family was not among the great powers of Italy, but they were substantial. They owned several castles, commanded military forces, and moved in the circles of kings and emperors. Landulf himself was a knight who had fought in the service of Emperor Frederick II, the brilliant and controversial monarch known as Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. Thomas was the youngest of at least 7 children, perhaps as many as 9. The sources disagree. His brothers were being raised to be warriors and lords, to manage estates and lead men in battle. His sisters would be married off to strengthen alliances with other noble families. As the youngest son, Thomas faced a different destiny. In the aristocratic families of medieval Europe, younger sons often entered the church. It was a respectable career that brought honour to the family and, if one rose high enough, considerable power. But for the Aquino family, placing a son in the church had a specific strategic purpose. Just a few miles from Roccasecca stood the great Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, founded in the 6th century by St. Benedict himself. Monte Cassino was one of the wealthiest and most powerful monasteries in all of Christendom. Its abbot wielded influence that rivaled bishops and princes, and the Aquino family had long maintained close ties with the monastery. Landulf and Theodora decided that their youngest son would be offered to Monte Cassino. If all went well, Thomas might one day become abbot, bringing glory and political advantage to the family. It was a plan made by parents who thought they understood how the world worked, who could not imagine that their quiet youngest son had any plans of his own. The family called him the little one, Piccolo. He was a large child who would grow into a very large man, but he was quiet, contemplative, apparently lost in thought for long stretches. While his brothers practiced with wooden swords and learned to ride war horses, young Thomas seemed content to sit alone, observing the world with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. There was a moment, recorded by early biographers though impossible to verify, that supposedly revealed the child's future vocation. Thomas was very young, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. He had been playing with other children when suddenly he approached one of the adults and asked a question. "What is God?" The adult, startled by the earnestness of the child's inquiry, had no ready answer. Thomas waited patiently, then wandered off, apparently to contemplate the question on his own. Whether this story is true or pious invention, it captured something essential about Thomas Aquinas. The question, "What is God?" would occupy him for the rest of his life. He would approach it with every intellectual tool available, examining it from every angle, building argument upon argument until he'd constructed the most comprehensive answer ever attempted. But he never stopped asking. The household at Roccasecca was devout in the conventional manner of medieval nobility. Mass was attended, saints' days were observed, prayers were said. But Theodora was particularly religious, more so than her warrior husband. She personally oversaw the religious education of her children, ensuring that young Thomas learned his prayers, his catechism, and the basic Latin necessary for liturgy. The boy absorbed it all with that same quiet intensity. He memorized easily. He asked questions that suggested he was thinking about what the words meant, not just repeating them. And when he was approximately 5 years old, his parents made good on their plan. Thomas was sent to Monte Cassino to begin his education as an oblate, a child offered to the monastery with the expectation that he would eventually become a monk. Monte Cassino occupied a hilltop that dominated the surrounding countryside. The monastery had been destroyed and rebuilt several times over the centuries, most recently in the 10th century after Saracen raiders had burned it to the ground. But by the 13th century it had recovered its wealth and prestige. The abbey church was magnificent. The library held hundreds of manuscripts, an enormous collection for the time, and the monks who lived there followed the rule of St. Benedict, a 6th century code that governed every hour of their lives with prayer, work, and study. For a child of 5 or 6, entering Monte Cassino meant leaving home, perhaps forever. The monastery was only a few miles from Roccasecca, but the distance was absolute. Oblates lived within the monastic enclosure, cut off from family, raised by the monks to become monks themselves. They rose before dawn for vigils, the first of 7 daily prayer services that mark the monastic day. They learned to read and write Latin. They memorized psalms and hymns. They studied grammar, rhetoric, and the basics of theology. Thomas spent nearly 9 years at Monte Cassino, from approximately 1230 to 1239. The records of his time there are sparse, but we can reconstruct the general pattern of his life from what we know of monastic education in this period. The life of an oblate began before sunrise. At approximately 4 in the morning, even in the darkness of winter, a monk would move through the dormitory ringing a small bell. The children would rise from their narrow beds, dress quickly in the cold, monastic buildings were rarely heated, and make their way to the chapel for vigils, the first of the 7 daily prayer services that structured monastic life. Vigils consisted of psalms, readings from scripture, and silent prayer. The boys, some as young as 5 or 6, would stand or kneel for an hour, fighting sleep, learning to offer their attention to God before their minds were fully awake. This discipline of prayer before thought, of worship before work, was fundamental to the Benedictine vision. The day began with God, and everything else followed from that beginning. After vigils came lauds, the morning prayer at daybreak. Then the community processed to the refectory for a simple breakfast. Bread and watered wine usually, sometimes porridge. The meal was eaten in silence while one of the monks read aloud from a spiritual text. Young Thomas learned early to eat while concentrating on something other than food, a habit that would stay with him throughout his life. Following breakfast came the first lessons of the day. The oblates would gather in a room set aside for instruction, where a monk assigned to teaching would drill them in Latin grammar. Latin was the language of the church, of learning, of everything that mattered beyond the local vernacular. A boy who could not read and write Latin fluently had no future in the medieval church. The pedagogy was rigorous and repetitive. Boys memorized declensions and conjugations, chanted them in unison, wrote them on wax tablets over and over until the patterns became automatic. Thomas had a gift for languages. The logical structure of Latin grammar appealed to his systematic mind. While other boys struggled with irregular verbs and complex syntax, Thomas absorbed the rules and began to internalize them, eventually writing Latin with a clarity and precision that would mark all his later work. After grammar came rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech and elegant expression. The boys studied model orations from Cicero and Quintilian, learning to construct arguments, appeal to audiences, and deploy the figures of speech that made language beautiful as well as functional. Thomas was less interested in the ornamental aspects of rhetoric than in its logical structure. He wanted to understand how arguments worked, how one proposition led to another, how to move from premises to conclusions with rigorous necessity. Logic, the third part of the trivium, was taught through the works of Aristotle, that the medieval West possessed at that time, primarily the categories non-interpretation, along with the later commentaries by Boethius. These texts introduced the young students to the basics of reasoning, the nature of propositions, the structure of syllogisms, the difference between valid and invalid arguments. For Thomas, this was revelation. Logic provided a method for pursuing truth that felt almost mathematical in its precision. If the premises were true and the reasoning valid, the conclusion had to be true. There was no ambiguity, no room for error. Later in life, Thomas would describe logic as the art of arts and the science of sciences because it provided the method for all other disciplines. At Monte Cassino, he encountered this tool for the first time and recognized its power. The curriculum also included the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were considered more advanced subjects, reserved for older students who had mastered the basics. Arithmetic meant not calculation for practical purposes, but the study of number theory, the properties and relationships of numbers themselves. Geometry meant Euclid's demonstrations, learning to construct proofs that moved from axioms to theorems with logical necessity. Music was understood not as performance, but as the mathematical study of harmonic ratios. Why do certain combinations of notes sound consonant while others sound dissonant? The answer lay in mathematics, in the ratios between the frequencies of different pitches. A student who understood music understood a fundamental truth. The universe operates according to mathematical principles that the mind can grasp. Astronomy meant studying the movements of the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, planets, and stars. Medieval astronomy, inherited from the Greeks through Latin translations, presented a geocentric universe with the Earth at the centre and everything else revolving around it in perfect circular motions. The movements were complex, requiring intricate calculations to predict eclipses and the positions of planets. But they were orderly, governed by laws that human reason could discover. Throughout all this education, the rhythm of prayer continued. 7 times a day the oblates stopped their studies and joined the monks in chapel for the divine office. Vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and complin. The psalms were sung in order, the entire psalter recited each week. The boys memorized the psalm texts, the melodies, the ritual gestures. Prayer became as automatic as breathing, a constant background to all other activities, and he would have learned silence. The Benedictine rule placed great emphasis on taciturnity, on governing the tongue, on avoiding idle chatter. For a child naturally inclined to quiet contemplation, this discipline came easily, too easily perhaps. The other oblates, the young boys who had become his classmates and companions, began to notice that Thomas rarely spoke. He was always present, always attentive, but maddeningly silent. They started calling him the dumb ox. He was large for his age, growing into the massive frame that would characterize him as an adult. He moved slowly, deliberately, with none of the quick, restless energy of other children, and he almost never volunteered answers in class, even when it was clear he knew them. To the other boys he seemed slow-witted, a gentle giant who had been sent to the monastery because he was unfit for anything else. The truth, which some of the more perceptive monks began to recognize, was quite different. Thomas's silence was not stupidity, but intense concentration. He was not slow to understand, but thorough in his understanding. Where other students heard a lesson and immediately recited it back, Thomas heard the lesson, thought about it, examined it from multiple angles, tested it against what he already knew, and only then, if asked directly, offered a response that showed he had absorbed not just the words but their meaning. One of the monks, perhaps noticing that Thomas's silence might conceal something other than stupidity, began to pay closer attention to the boy. He observed that Thomas, when pressed, could answer questions with remarkable precision, that his written work, when he produced it, showed unusual clarity of thought, that there was something going on behind those quiet eyes that the other children could not see. But before this monk could fully assess the young oblate's abilities, the world outside the monastery intruded in a way that would change Thomas's life forever. In 1239, Emperor Frederick II, in one of his perpetual conflicts with Pope Gregory IX, sent his army to occupy Monte Cassino. The monastery that had seemed an eternal refuge was suddenly a military objective. The monks were expelled, the oblates were sent home, and Thomas, at approximately 14 years old, returned to his family's castle, his monastic career apparently ended before it had truly begun. But the years at Monte Cassino had marked him. He had tasted the life of the mind. He had discovered that the deepest questions, what is God? What is truth? How should we live? could be approached with systematic rigour. He had learned that silence could be a form of attention, that listening could be a form of learning, and he had no intention of returning to the life of a nobleman's son, managing estates and fighting petty wars. His parents, confronted with a 14-year-old who had been raised as a monk but could no longer enter Monte Cassino, needed to make new plans. Thomas would continue his education, they decided, but not at another monastery. He would go to the new university at Naples, where he could study the liberal arts and prepare for a career in the church through the conventional route of academic advancement. What Landulf and Theodora could not have known was that at the University of Naples their quiet youngest son would encounter ideas and people that would set him on a collision course with their ambitions and eventually change the history of Christian thought. The University of Naples was unlike anything Thomas had experienced at Monte Cassino. Founded in 1224 by Emperor Frederick II himself, it was a bold experiment in education designed to train administrators for the imperial bureaucracy. Unlike the older universities at Paris and Bologna, which had grown organically from cathedral schools and guilds of masters, Naples was a deliberate creation, a secular institution that existed outside the direct control of the church. Thomas arrived in 1239, a shy 14-year-old giant who spoke little and listened intensely. The city itself must have been overwhelming after the quiet enclosure of the monastery. Naples was one of the largest cities in Italy, a bustling port where merchants from across the Mediterranean brought goods and ideas. The streets were crowded, noisy, filled with the smells of cooking and sewage, alive with the constant motion of commerce. But within the university walls, Thomas found something that felt like home. Here were men devoted to learning for its own sake. Here were books he had never encountered, ideas that pushed beyond the standard curriculum of monastic education. The faculty at Naples included some of the finest scholars in Italy, men who had studied at Paris and Bologna, who knew not just theology but law, medicine, mathematics, and the new natural philosophy that was causing such controversy. Thomas threw himself into his studies with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. He studied the 7 liberal arts in depth: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were considered preparatory subjects, the foundation upon which all higher learning rested. But Thomas approached them with a thoroughness that surprised his teachers. He wanted to understand not just what the authorities said, but why they said it, how the arguments worked, where the logic led. It was here, at Naples, that Thomas first encountered the complete works of Aristotle in the new Latin translations. The banned books were circulating despite ecclesiastical prohibition. Students copied them secretly. Masters taught them in private sessions. And Thomas, whose hunger for knowledge was beginning to reveal itself, read everything he could find. Aristotle's logic was a revelation. Here was a systematic method for pursuing truth, for distinguishing valid arguments from invalid ones, for building knowledge from first principles. The syllogism, if all A is B and all B is C, then all A is C, provided a tool for rigorous demonstration that felt, to Thomas's methodical mind, like a gift from God himself. But it was Aristotle's metaphysics that truly seized Thomas's imagination. Here was a philosopher who asked the deepest questions. What is being? What is the relationship between essence and existence? What is the first cause? And pursued them with relentless logical rigour. Aristotle argued that we could know the natural world through observation and reason. That philosophy could arrive at truth about fundamental reality. That there must be an unmoved mover, a first cause that itself is uncaused, keeping all else in motion. The Christian authorities saw danger in these ideas. Aristotle's unmoved mover was not the personal God of the Bible who created the world out of love and watched over his creation with providential care. Aristotle's philosophy seemed to suggest that the world might be eternal, that God might not know or care about individual humans, that everything could be explained through natural causes without reference to divine intervention. But Thomas, even at 15 or 16, saw something else. He saw potential. What if Aristotle's philosophy, properly understood and carefully corrected where it conflicted with revelation, could actually support and strengthen Christian theology? What if reason and faith, far from being enemies, were complementary paths to truth? What if the unmoved mover and the God of Abraham were the same reality, approached from different angles? These were dangerous thoughts to develop. They would require years of work, a mastery of both philosophy and theology that few possessed. They would invite condemnation from those who feared any contamination of sacred truth with pagan wisdom. But Thomas was beginning to understand that this would be his life's work. He would build the bridge between Aristotle and Christ. First, however, he needed to complete his education. And at Naples, he encountered another group that would determine the entire course of his life, the Dominicans. The order of preachers, founded by St. Dominic just 25 years earlier, was revolutionizing religious life. Unlike the traditional monastic orders like the Benedictines, who lived in rural monasteries removed from the world, the Dominicans were mendicants, begging friars who owned no property, lived in cities, and dedicated themselves to preaching and teaching. They wore simple black and white habits, lived in poverty, and pursued learning with an intensity that matched the new universities. The Dominican house at Naples was small but vibrant. The friars there had recognized that the intellectual ferment of the university was their mission field. They attracted students who were drawn to the life of the mind, who wanted to combine scholarly rigor with religious devotion, and they noticed the large, silent student who attended their lectures and never spoke, but whose eyes suggested he was absorbing everything. Thomas began spending more time at the Dominican convent. He attended their discussions, participated in their prayer life, and gradually felt himself drawn to their vision of Christianity. Here was an order that valued learning not as a distraction from holiness, but as a form of service to God. Here were men who believed that intellectual work could be a vocation, that studying and teaching were ways of preaching the gospel. Sometime in 1243 or early 1244, Thomas made a decision that would enrage his family and nearly cost him his freedom. He asked to join the Dominicans. For his family, this was catastrophic. They had planned for Thomas to become a Benedictine monk at Monte Cassino, ideally rising to become abbot, bringing honour and influence to the Aquino family. The Benedictines were respectable, wealthy, powerful. The Dominicans were new, poor, and marginally respectable in aristocratic eyes. They were beggars, wanderers, upstarts with no property or established position. Worse, Dominican life meant true poverty. A Benedictine abbot lived in comfort, wielding power and wealth. A Dominican friar owned nothing, not even his books, and could be sent anywhere in Europe at the order's discretion. Thomas would be lost to the family, unable to advance their interests, his education wasted on wandering and begging. His mother Theodora was horrified. She'd been widowed. Landulf had died sometime around 1243, and now her youngest son, the one who was supposed to bring glory to the family through the church, wanted to throw everything away for a life of poverty. She appealed to him. She argued. She wept. Thomas remained unmoved, calm, gentle, but absolutely certain. The Dominicans, aware that the family would not accept this easily, decided to move Thomas out of Naples before Theodora could intervene more forcefully. In the spring of 1244, they sent him north toward Rome and eventually Paris, where the order had one of its great houses of study. He was 19 years old, wearing the black and white habit of a Dominican friar, and travelling with a small group of his new brothers. They never made it to Rome. Theodora had appealed to Thomas's brothers, the warriors of the family. If persuasion would not work, force would. The brothers, leading a group of armed men, ambushed the travelling friars on the road. They seized Thomas, placed him on a horse, and dragged him back to the family castle at Roccasecca. The quiet academic life was about to become a family war. Thomas was imprisoned in the family castle at Roccasecca. For approximately 1 year, from sometime in 1244 to 1245, the young friar was held captive by his own family, who were determined to break his will and force him to abandon the Dominicans. They tried persuasion first. His mother pleaded with him, reminding him of his duty to the family. His brothers mocked him, calling him foolish for choosing beggary over comfort. His sisters added their voices, arguing that he was throwing away the security and respect that a position in the Benedictine order would provide. Thomas listened to it all with patient silence, then quietly refused. The imprisonment was not brutal in the sense of physical torture, but it was real confinement. Thomas was locked in a tower room. He was allowed no contact with other Dominicans. He could not attend to his studies or participate in the religious life he had chosen. His family controlled his movements, his reading material, and his access to the outside world. According to the early biographies, his brothers attempted something more drastic. Convinced that perhaps Thomas's commitment to celibacy was the real issue, they arranged for a beautiful woman to be sent to his room, hoping that physical seduction would shake his resolve. The story, recorded by William of Tocco and Peter Calo within decades of Thomas's death, says that Thomas seized a burning brand from the fireplace and drove the woman from the room. He then used the brand to mark a cross on the wall, fell to his knees, and prayed for the grace to maintain his chastity. Whether this incident occurred exactly as described or was embellished by pious biographers, it reflected something true about Thomas's character. He had made a decision based on what he understood to be God's will for his life, and no amount of pressure would move him from it. His stubbornness was not emotional or reactive. It was the same methodical determination that would later characterize his intellectual work. He had reasoned his way to a conclusion, and he would stand by it. But Thomas was not simply enduring imprisonment passively. He used the time to study. His sisters, who had more sympathy for him than his brothers did, smuggled books to him. He received a copy of the Bible, Peter Lombard's Sentences, the standard theological textbook of the era, and some works of Aristotle. Locked in his tower room, Thomas read and memorized. Some sources claim he memorized the entire Bible during his captivity. Whether or not this is literally true, he emerged from his imprisonment with a command of Scripture that would astonish his later teachers. His sisters, particularly one named Marotta, gradually became sympathetic to his cause. They began to see his commitment as genuine holiness, rather than foolish obstinacy. According to some accounts, they helped him maintain secret contact with the Dominicans, passing messages through trusted servants. The friars assured Thomas that they had not forgotten him, that they would welcome him back when he could escape or be released. After approximately a year, the family's resistance began to crumble. Thomas would not yield. His imprisonment was becoming an embarrassment. The Dominicans were making their displeasure known, and the ecclesiastical authorities were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about a young man being forcibly prevented from pursuing a religious vocation. Finally, Theodora and her sons conceded defeat, though they tried to save face. According to one account, Marotta and perhaps another sister helped Thomas escape by lowering him out of a window in a basket. Another version says the family simply released him, claiming they had been trying to test the sincerity of his vocation. Whatever the exact circumstances, sometime in 1245, Thomas was free to return to the Dominicans. He went immediately to Naples, rejoined his brothers in the order, and prepared to continue the journey that had been so violently interrupted. This time there would be no ambush. The family's resistance was broken. Thomas was sent north, first to Rome, where he met the Master General of the Dominican order, then onward to Paris, the intellectual capital of Christian Europe. He was approximately 20 years old. He had endured a year of imprisonment without wavering. He had used that year to deepen his knowledge of scripture and theology, and he was about to meet the man who had recognized that the dumb ox everyone underestimated was actually the greatest theological mind of the century. Paris in 1245 was the undisputed centre of Christian learning. The University of Paris, which had emerged from the cathedral schools of the previous century, was now the most prestigious institution of higher education in Europe. Students came from every corner of Christendom to study there. Masters competed for students and prestige, and the theological faculty in particular was locked in fierce debates over the new Aristotelian philosophy and its compatibility with Christian doctrine. The Dominicans had established a house of studies at the convent of Saint-Jacques in Paris. Here they trained their most promising young friars, preparing them for careers as teachers and preachers. The community was small, intense, and intellectually rigorous. Every day included not only the full schedule of Dominican prayer life, but also lectures, disputations, and private study. Thomas arrived and immediately resumed his silence. He attended lectures faithfully. He took notes meticulously. He participated when required. But he volunteered nothing, asked no questions publicly, and generally gave the impression of a large, slow student who was perhaps out of his depth in this rarefied academic atmosphere. His fellow students, not knowing about his imprisonment or his studies in Naples, saw only the exterior. The jokes from Monte Cassino resumed. The dumb ox, the silent giant, the poor fellow who had somehow been admitted to the most demanding intellectual environment in Europe but clearly couldn't keep up. The professor who taught the introductory course in theology was Albert the Great, himself a Dominican and already recognized as one of the finest minds of his generation. Albert was attempting something revolutionary. He was trying to make the complete works of Aristotle, natural philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, accessible to Christian scholars. He wrote extensive commentaries explaining Aristotle's ideas, correcting them where they contradicted Christian doctrine, and demonstrating that the pagan philosopher could be read profitably by believers. Albert noticed the large silent student in his lectures. Something about Thomas's attention, the way he followed arguments, the care with which he took notes, suggested that more was happening behind that placid exterior than the other students realized. Albert decided to test his suspicion. In the medieval university, students were expected to participate in disputations, formal debates on theological or philosophical questions. A master would propose a question, students would argue various positions, and the master would resolve the dispute at the end. It was training in logic, rhetoric, and quick thinking. One day, Albert called on Thomas to defend a particular position in a disputation. The other students snickered. This should be entertaining. The dumb ox trying to construct an argument. Thomas rose slowly to his feet and began to speak. The quality of his Latin was immediately apparent, clear, precise, elegant. More striking was the structure of his argument. He stated the question clearly. He presented the objections to his position fairly and completely. He responded to each objection systematically, showing exactly where the flaw in reasoning occurred. He built his positive case step by step, each premise supporting the next, until the conclusion followed with geometric inevitability. The room had gone completely silent. This was not the fumbling response they had expected. This was the work of a mature thinker who understood not just the content but the method of theological reasoning. When Thomas finished and sat down, there was a moment of stunned silence. Later, a fellow student, either out of genuine concern or continuing mockery, offered to help Thomas with his notes. Thomas politely declined. The student pressed, suggesting that Thomas didn't understand the material and needed assistance. Thomas, with his characteristic patience, replied that he understood perfectly well. The student challenged him to prove it by explaining a particularly difficult point from Albert's lecture. Thomas proceeded to recite the entire lecture from memory, not word for word but concept by concept, reconstructing Albert's argument with perfect accuracy. More than that, he pointed out several places where Albert's reasoning could be strengthened, or where objections could be anticipated and answered. The student reported this to Albert. The professor called Thomas in for a private conversation. He questioned him closely, probing the depth of his knowledge. What emerged was that Thomas had not only absorbed everything from Albert's lectures, but had also read widely on his own. He knew the Church Fathers. He had studied the Arabic commentators on Aristotle. He understood logic and metaphysics at a level that exceeded many of the advanced students. Albert made a prediction that has become one of the most famous quotes in medieval education. Speaking to the other students, he said, "You call him the dumb ox, but I tell you that the bellowing of this ox will be heard throughout the world." It was a statement of profound recognition. Albert had identified in Thomas something that others missed, a mind of extraordinary power operating with unusual patience and thoroughness. Thomas didn't speak quickly because he thought deeply. He didn't show off because he was pursuing truth rather than reputation. And given the proper training and guidance, he would produce work of lasting significance. Albert took Thomas under his direct tutelage. For the next 3 years, from approximately 1245 to 1248, Thomas studied with the finest philosophical theologian of his generation. They read Aristotle together. They discussed the problems that Aristotelian philosophy posed for Christian doctrine. They explored how reason and revelation might be harmonized. Albert was attempting to map this territory. Thomas would complete the journey. In 1248, Albert was sent to establish a new Dominican house of studies in Cologne. He took Thomas with him, recognizing that this student needed more time to develop before being thrust into independent teaching. For 4 more years, Thomas remained Albert's student and assistant, learning not just content but method, not just conclusions but how to think. They walked together through the streets of Cologne discussing metaphysics. They debated the nature of angels, the relationship between soul and body, the possibility of proving God's existence through reason alone. Albert encouraged Thomas to be bold in his thinking, to follow arguments wherever they led, to fear no question because truth could ultimately come only from God. But Albert also taught Thomas something that would mark all his later work: intellectual humility. Thomas learned to state opposing arguments fairly before answering them, to acknowledge the strength in positions he disagreed with, to recognize that sincere thinkers might reach different conclusions without being fools or heretics. This spirit of generous intellectual engagement would become one of the hallmarks of Thomas's mature work. By 1252, Thomas was ready. At approximately 27 years old, he returned to Paris to begin teaching on his own. The years of silence were ending. The dumb ox was about to bellow. Thomas returned to Paris in 1252 to begin the next stage of his academic career, earning the Licentia Docendi, the license to teach theology. This was an arduous process that typically took several years. A candidate had to lecture on the Bible for 2 years as a biblical bachelor, then lecture on Peter Lombard's sentences for 2 more years as a sententiarius. Only after successfully completing these stages and defending a formal thesis could one become a master of theology, authorized to hold a chair and teach independently. Thomas began with lectures on the Bible. The Dominican house at Saint-Jacques assigned him the books of Isaiah and Matthew. His approach was methodical and thorough. He examined the literal meaning of the text, what the words actually said in their historical context. Then he explored the spiritual meanings, the allegorical sense, which revealed truths about Christ and the Church, the moral sense, which taught how to live virtuously, and the anagogical sense, which pointed toward eternal realities. But Thomas brought something new to biblical commentary. He used Aristotelian logic to analyze the structure of arguments within Scripture. He asked philosophical questions about the nature of prophecy, the psychology of faith, the metaphysics of divine action. Other commentators treated the Bible as a repository of proof texts. Thomas treated it as a coherent intellectual whole that could be understood through the same rigorous methods used in philosophy. His lectures attracted attention. Students who came expecting conventional piety found themselves encountering serious philosophical analysis. Thomas was demonstrating that faith-seeking understanding, the old Augustinian formula, could be pursued with the tools of Aristotelian logic without diminishing the sacred character of the text. From 1254 to 1256, he lectured on the sentences of Peter Lombard, the standard theological textbook compiled in the 12th century. The Sentences was a massive compilation of quotations from the Church Fathers organized around central theological questions. Every theology student had to master it. Most treated it as an exercise in memorization and conventional interpretation. Thomas transformed it. He used the Sentences as a framework for raising every major question in Christian theology: the nature of God, the Trinity, creation, angels, human nature, sin, grace, Christ, the sacraments, and the last things. For each question, he would state the problem clearly, present the major opinions, offer his own solution with supporting arguments, then respond to objections. This method, state the question, present objections, develop the argument, respond to objections, was not new. It was the standard format of the quaestio, the disputed question that formed the backbone of medieval university teaching. But Thomas brought unprecedented clarity and systematic rigour to it. His arguments were like geometric proofs, each step following necessarily from the previous one. His lectures on the Sentences would eventually be edited and published, becoming one of his major early works. They filled 4 large volumes and covered virtually every topic in Christian theology. He was not yet 30 years old, and he was already producing work of startling maturity and comprehensiveness. But his path to becoming a full master of theology hit an unexpected obstacle. A vicious political and intellectual conflict was brewing at the University of Paris that would threaten not just Thomas's career, but the entire Dominican and Franciscan presence at the university. The secular masters, professors who were not members of religious orders, had long resented the mendicant friars. The Dominicans and Franciscans held 2 of the theology chairs at Paris, and they had been attracting the best students. The secular masters saw this as unfair competition. The friars lived in poverty, supported by their orders, and could afford to charge no fees. The secular masters needed student fees to live. In 1252, the seculars had attempted to force the mendicants to join a university-wide strike against the city authorities. The friars refused, arguing that their obedience was to their religious superiors, not to the university guild. This refusal sparked a bitter conflict that festered for years. By 1256, the hostility erupted into open warfare. William of Saint-Amour, a secular master, published a treatise called The Perils of the Last Times, which argued that the mendicant orders were frauds, that their claims to poverty were false, and that they had no right to teach or preach. The tract was filled with apocalyptic rhetoric, suggesting that the friars were signs of the coming Antichrist. The seculars convinced the university authorities to refuse to grant licenses to any new mendicant masters. Thomas, despite having completed all the requirements, could not formally become a master of theology because he was a Dominican. His academic career was being blocked by politics. The Dominicans fought back. They appealed to Pope Alexander IV, who strongly supported the mendicant orders. The Pope condemned William of St. Amour's treatise and eventually ordered the University of Paris to admit the mendicant masters. In 1256, under papal pressure, the university relented. Thomas Aquinas was formally admitted as a master of theology. But the experience had marked him. He had seen how intellectual disputes could be poisoned by personal animosity and institutional jealousy. He had witnessed the ugly reality that academic positions were prizes to be fought over, not just stages for the pursuit of truth. And he had been forced to defend, both in formal disputations and in written treatises, the legitimacy of the mendicant life and the right of the friars to teach. This defence of the mendicant orders produced one of Thomas's early works, Against Those Who Attack the Religious Life. It was not his most profound writing, but it showed his ability to argue a practical case with the same logical rigour he brought to purely theoretical questions. The friars had every right to live in poverty and to teach the gospel. The secular master's opposition was based on envy rather than principle. Now, at age 31, Thomas held a chair of theology at the University of Paris, the most prestigious academic position in Christendom. The real work of his life was about to begin. Thomas's years as a regent master at Paris, from 1256 to 1259, established the pattern his life would follow for the next 2 decades. His days were consumed by teaching, writing, and the constant demands of academic and religious life. Yet from this period of relentless productivity emerged a calm, methodical routine that would produce one of the most voluminous bodies of work in intellectual history. The rhythm of the medieval university was unlike anything in the modern world. Classes began early, immediately after the morning religious services. Students gathered in unheated lecture halls, sitting on benches or standing for hours as the master lectured from his elevated chair. In winter, they wore heavy cloaks and stamped their feet to keep warm. In summer, they wilted in the heat, fighting drowsiness as Latin orations droned on. The lecture hall at the Dominican Studium was more modest than the great halls at the university proper, but the intellectual standard was just as rigorous. Thomas's students were not aristocratic dilettantes seeking social polish, but serious men preparing for lives of preaching and teaching. They came from across Europe, Germans, English, Italians, Spaniards, brought together by a shared vocation and a common language, Latin, the tongue in which all serious discourse occurred. Thomas's lectures followed the standard scholastic method. He would announce the text to be examined, a book of scripture, a section of the sentences, a work of Aristotle. He would read a passage aloud, then pause to explain its meaning. The explanation would proceed in layers. First, the literal sense, what the words actually said in their grammatical and historical context. Then, if the text was scripture, the spiritual senses, the allegorical meaning, revealing truths about Christ and the Church, the moral meaning, teaching virtue, the anagogical meaning, pointing toward eternal realities. But Thomas brought something distinctive to this traditional method. He subjected every passage to philosophical analysis. When the text made a claim about reality, Thomas asked whether the claim could be defended rationally. When the text presented an argument, Thomas examined whether the argument was valid. When different authoritative texts seemed to contradict each other, Thomas showed how they could be reconciled by distinguishing different senses of key terms. This was not dry pedantry. It was training the mind to think precisely, to analyse arguments, to recognise when words were being used in different senses. A student who could follow Thomas's distinctions and appreciate their necessity was learning to think philosophically, not just to memorise authoritative opinions. He rose before dawn for matins, the first of the 7 daily prayer services required of Dominicans. After an hour of communal prayer chanting psalms in the chapel, he celebrated or attended Mass. Then, while most of the community broke their fast, Thomas went to his cell to write. These early morning hours between approximately 5 and 7 were his most productive. His mind was clearest then, and the house was quiet. The cell where Thomas worked was sparse even by Dominican standards. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a few shelves for books and manuscripts, a crucifix on the wall. Nothing decorative, nothing superfluous. The room was cold in winter, hot in summer. Light came from a single small window, and after dark from candles that Thomas purchased with his meagre allowance. At this desk in these early morning hours, Thomas produced an astonishing volume of work. He wrote with a stylus on wax tablets when he was drafting, composing directly in Latin with few corrections. When a section was complete, he would dictate it to a secretary who would transcribe it onto parchment, in the neat hand required for permanent records. But often Thomas wrote directly onto parchment himself, his handwriting becoming famously difficult to read, rushed, abbreviated, the thoughts outpacing the hand that tried to capture them. At 7 he went to the refectory for the community meal, though accounts suggest he often ate absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Then came the first round of lectures. As a regent master, Thomas was required to deliver ordinary lectures on scripture and theology, following a prescribed curriculum. These lectures ran for 2 or 3 hours, beginning around 8 in the morning. The format was formal. The master sat in his chair, elevated above the students, and commented on a text. For Thomas, this might be a book of the Bible or a section of the sentences. Students took notes frantically, trying to capture not just the master's words but his reasoning. Thomas spoke clearly, without rhetorical flourishes, developing his arguments step by step. His Latin was precise and technical, shorn of the flowery ornamentation that other masters used. Some students found his style difficult at first. They were accustomed to professors who deployed classical rhetoric, who used elegant periodic sentences and adorned their arguments with quotations from the poets. Thomas offered none of this. His sentences were direct, his vocabulary limited to the terms necessary for precision. He repeated key phrases exactly when he needed to refer to the same concept, avoiding variation for the sake of avoiding variation. It was the style of a geometrician, not an orator. But students who persisted discovered the power of this approach. Thomas never wasted words. Every sentence advanced the argument. Every distinction clarified a confusion. Every objection that he raised was genuine, and every response actually resolved it. There was no smoke and mirrors, no rhetorical tricks disguising weak reasoning, just relentless logical development from premises to conclusion. After the morning lectures came dinner, the main meal of the day, eaten around noon. The Dominicans ate in silence while one of the brothers read aloud from a spiritual or edifying text. Thomas was known for his remarkable abstraction during meals. He would sometimes forget to eat at all, lost in thought about some problem he was working through. His fellow friars learned to prompt him gently when his food sat untouched. The refectory meals revealed something about monastic life that modern people often miss. These men lived in community, saw each other constantly, knew each other's habits and quirks intimately. Yet they maintained a discipline of silence and privacy that protected interior space. They were not friends in the modern sense, sharing confidences and emotions. They were brothers united by a common vocation, supporting each other's spiritual life while respecting each individual's relationship with God. Thomas formed genuine friendships within this framework, particularly with Reginald of Piperno, who would become his secretary and constant companion. But even these close relationships maintained boundaries. Thomas did not burden others with his struggles or seek emotional support for his difficulties. He brought his troubles to God in prayer and worked through his intellectual problems in writing. The Dominican community provided structure and fraternal charity. But the interior work of the soul was solitary. The afternoon brought more academic work. Several times a week, Thomas presided over disputations. These were formal exercises where students or other masters would raise objections to theological positions, and Thomas would have to defend the orthodox view or propose solutions. The disputations were combative, intellectual contests where reputation could be won or lost. The format of a disputation was highly structured. It typically began with a respondent proposing a thesis. For example, the world was created in time. Then opponents would raise objections. But Aristotle proves that the world is eternal. Therefore, the world was not created in time. The respondent would attempt to answer each objection. After several rounds of objection and response, the master would intervene with a determinatio, a definitive resolution of the question that showed which arguments were valid and which failed. Thomas approached disputations with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. He listened carefully to objections, often summarizing them more clearly than those who raised them. He acknowledged the force of good arguments, even when he disagreed with the conclusions. Then he would systematically dismantle the objections and construct his own position, building from first principles to demonstrated conclusions. His skill in disputation was legendary. Opponents who came expecting to stump the Dominican master found themselves outmatched not through rhetorical tricks, but through sheer intellectual rigour. Thomas could see implications that others missed, spot fallacies that seemed persuasive at first glance, and construct arguments that proceeded with geometric necessity. Watching him in disputation was like watching a master craftsman at work, each move precise, each tool perfectly suited to its purpose. Twice a year, at Christmas and Easter, the university held quodlibetal disputations, whatever you wish, debates where anyone could ask the master any question on any topic. These were intellectual rodeos, opportunities for critics to try to embarrass or stump the master. Thomas fielded questions on everything from the nature of angels to the price of wheat, from the Trinity to whether it was sinful to charge interest on loans. His answers to these freeform questions would be collected and published as the Quodlibetal Questions, works that show the astonishing range of his knowledge and the versatility of his method. In the late afternoon, after Vespers prayer, Thomas would often return to his cell to write. This was when he worked on his major projects, the books that would occupy him for years. He wrote by hand, using the stylus and wax tablet that allowed for easy revision, or dictating to a secretary when the ideas came too fast for his own hand to capture. Evening brought Compline, the final prayer service of the day, then silence and sleep. But Thomas often worked late into the night, a candle burning in his cell, his massive form bent over a desk, writing with steady concentration. His secretaries reported that he could dictate on multiple projects simultaneously, switching from one to another without losing the thread of argument. This schedule, punishing by modern standards, was maintained year after year. Teaching, praying, writing, disputing. The rhythm of Dominican life provided the structure. Thomas's extraordinary capacity for sustained intellectual work filled every available hour. He wrote while others slept. He thought while others talked. His mind was always working, always turning over problems, always pushing toward greater clarity and comprehension. His appearance matched his methodical nature. He was very large, probably well over 6 feet tall and heavily built. His head was large, his features broad, his complexion dark. He moved slowly and deliberately, with none of the nervous energy that characterized many intellectuals. His voice was gentle, and he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. But those who knew him well noticed something else. In conversation about ideas, Thomas became animated. His eyes brightened. His hands moved to illustrate points. He lost his usual reserve and spoke with quiet passion about the questions that gripped him. Philosophy and theology were not academic exercises for Thomas. They were living engagements with truth itself. He was generous with his time despite its scarcity. Students could come to him with questions, and he would patiently explain difficult concepts. Junior Dominicans sought his advice on their own studies. Even those who disagreed with his positions found him respectful and willing to engage seriously with their objections. Yet he maintained boundaries. He avoided idle conversation. He did not attend social gatherings unless required by his position or obedience. He had friends among the faculty and his Dominican brothers, but his emotional life was reserved, focused on his work and his prayer. Some found this coldness. Others recognized it as the single-minded focus of someone pursuing a vision that consumed all his energy. During these Paris years, Thomas began work on 2 projects that would occupy him intermittently for the rest of his life. The first was a series of commentaries on Aristotle. Albert had begun this work, but Thomas would complete it with unprecedented thoroughness and insight. He wrote detailed commentaries on the physics, the metaphysics, the ethics, and other Aristotelian texts, explaining them clearly and showing how they could be read by Christian scholars. The second project was more ambitious. Thomas began to envision a comprehensive exposition of Christian theology that would present the entire faith systematically, starting from first principles and building to conclusions with rigorous logical demonstration. It would use Aristotelian philosophy as a tool, but would be ordered toward a single purpose: understanding divine truth. He called it the Summa Contra Gentiles, a comprehensive work against the Gentiles, or for those who did not yet accept Christian revelation. This work, begun in Paris and continued over several years, was Thomas's first attempt to systematize the entire body of Christian belief. It was organized in 4 books: God's existence and nature, creation, providence, and the specific doctrines of Christian faith. The method was philosophical. Thomas argued that many truths about God could be known through natural reason without revelation. God's existence, his unity, his wisdom and power, these could be demonstrated philosophically. Other truths, the Trinity, the Incarnation, required divine revelation but were not contrary to reason. The Summa Contra Gentiles showed Thomas's mature method fully developed. Each chapter raised a question, stated it precisely, presented and refuted errors, then developed the correct position with supporting arguments. The prose was spare and technical, but the architecture of the work was magnificent. It was a cathedral built of logic, each arch supporting the one above it, the whole structure rising toward the contemplation of God. But in 1259, before he could finish this massive project, Thomas's time in Paris ended. The Dominican order, in its wisdom, decided that their brilliant young master was needed elsewhere. He was recalled to Italy to teach in the Dominican schools there. At 34, Thomas packed his books and notes, said goodbye to his colleagues and students, and began the journey south. He would spend the next decade in Italy, teaching, writing, and navigating the dangerous politics of the papal court. Thomas spent the next 9 years, from 1259 to 1268, in Italy, moving between the Dominican houses at Naples, Orvieto, Rome, and Viterbo. These were years of extraordinary productivity. Away from the political conflicts and rigid structure of Paris, Thomas had more freedom to pursue his own projects while still maintaining his teaching obligations within the Dominican order. The papal court was itinerant during this period, moving between cities as political circumstances and summer heat dictated. The Pope and his curia represented not just spiritual authority but temporal power, involved in the complex politics of Italian city-states, the Holy Roman Empire, and the various kingdoms of Europe. Thomas, as a prominent Dominican theologian, was drawn into this world. Pope Urban IV made Thomas a papal theologian, a position that brought him into contact with the highest levels of church administration. He was consulted on theological questions that had political implications. He attended councils and commissions. He observed the machinery of ecclesiastical power up close. For a man devoted to the contemplative life of a scholar, this exposure to politics and power could have been corrupting. Thomas navigated it by maintaining his focus on intellectual work and refusing to seek advancement. It was during these Italian years that Thomas completed the Summa Contra Gentiles and began planning an even more ambitious project. But first, he undertook several works at the request of the popes he served. Urban IV commissioned Thomas to write theological treatises on topics the Pope considered important. Thomas produced works on the articles of faith, on the sacraments, on the errors of the Greeks in their understanding of the procession of the Holy Spirit. These were not Thomas's most original works, but they showed his ability to write clearly and authoritatively on command, defending orthodox positions against various challenges. More significant was Urban's request that Thomas compose the liturgy for a new feast day, Corpus Christi, the feast of the body of Christ. This celebration of the Eucharist had been established in 1264, and the Pope wanted an appropriate liturgical office for it. Thomas wrote hymns, prayers, and responses that are still used in Catholic worship. The hymns Pang Lingua and Tantum Ergo, with their profound theological poetry, showed that Thomas's gifts were not limited to philosophical prose. He could write verse that captured deep truth in beauty. But the most important work of these years was one that Thomas was not commissioned to write, but chose to undertake on his own. In 1261, at approximately 36 years old, he began what would become his masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, the comprehensive summation of sacred doctrine. The Summa was conceived as a teaching text, specifically designed for beginning students of theology. This might seem strange given its eventual size. It would run to approximately 2 million words, and its density. But Thomas had a specific pedagogical vision. He wanted to present the whole of Christian theology in a systematic, clear, and rigorously argued form, avoiding the confusion and repetition that plagued other theological compilations. The structure of the Summa would be unlike anything attempted before. It would proceed in 3 parts. The first would treat God, his existence, his nature, his creative activity, and his governance of creation. The second would treat man, human nature, happiness, virtues and vices, law and grace. The third would treat Christ, the incarnation, the sacraments, and the last things. Each part would be divided into questions, each question into articles, and each article would follow the same rigorous pattern. First, the article would state a position that seemed wrong, but that some people held. Then it would list objections to the correct view, usually 3 or 4 strong arguments against the truth Thomas wanted to defend. Then would come a brief statement of authority, a quotation from Scripture, or a church father establishing the correct position. Next came the body of the article, where Thomas developed his own argument for the truth, often building on Aristotelian philosophy. Finally, he would respond to each of the initial objections, showing exactly where they went wrong. This format, question, objections, authority, argument, replies to objections, became the signature of Thomistic method. It was a form of intellectual generosity. Thomas gave opposing views their strongest possible statement before answering them. He forced himself to engage with the best arguments against his positions. The result was a work that was both confident in its conclusions and honest about the difficulties involved in reaching them. Thomas began writing the Summa in 1265 or 1266. He would work on it for the rest of his life, never quite completing it. The first part, treating God and creation, was finished in Italy. The second part, treating human action and ethics, would be written over many years in both Italy and France. The third part on Christ and the sacraments would remain unfinished at his death. But from the beginning, the Summa's scope was breathtaking. Thomas addressed every major question in Christian theology and many minor ones. Does God exist? Can we know anything about God's nature? How many angels are there? How do angels think? What is the relationship between soul and body? What is virtue? What is law? What is grace? Question after question, article after article, the work grew as Thomas wrote steadily, year after year. During these Italian years, Thomas also became involved in one of the strangest intellectual projects of his career. William of Moerbeke, a fellow Dominican and a gifted linguist, had access to Greek manuscripts of Aristotle. Unlike the Latin translations from Arabic that Thomas had been using, these were direct translations from the original Greek. William worked with Thomas to produce new, more accurate Latin versions of Aristotle's works. Thomas revised his commentaries based on these better texts. He discovered nuances he had missed in the Arabic to Latin translations. He refined his understanding of Aristotle's arguments, and William, at Thomas's request, translated other Greek works that had never been available in Latin. Commentaries by Alexander of Aphrodisias and other ancient interpreters, works by Proclus and other Neoplatonist philosophers, and theological works by the Greek Church Fathers. This collaboration between the philosopher-theologian and the translator produced a flood of new material for Latin scholars. Thomas was helping to recover the entire Greek philosophical tradition for the medieval West. His commentaries on Aristotle, based on the improved translations, became standard reference works that would be used for centuries. Yet throughout these years of intense productivity, Thomas maintained the regular pattern of Dominican life. 7 times a day he stopped his work to pray in community. He preached regularly to the Dominican brothers. He fulfilled his duties as a teacher in the order's schools. He heard confessions, gave spiritual direction, and participated in the ordinary administrative work of religious life. Those who observed him during this period noted his extraordinary capacity for concentration. He could write for hours without apparent fatigue, his hand moving steadily across the page. He could switch from one project to another without confusion. He seemed to hold multiple complex arguments in his mind simultaneously, developing them in parallel. But they also noted his abstraction from ordinary concerns. There are stories of Thomas being so lost in thought that he walked past colleagues without seeing them, or sat through meals without eating. Once, invited to dine with King Louis IX of France during the king's visit to Paris, Thomas was so absorbed in working out a theological problem that he suddenly struck the table and exclaimed, "That settles the Manichaeans!" then called for his secretary to write down the solution before he forgot it. The king, rather than being offended, ordered paper and ink brought so the friar could record his thoughts. This combination of intense productivity and contemplative withdrawal characterized Thomas's entire mature life. He was fully engaged with ideas but only partially present in the social world. His friendships were real but not intimate. His emotional life was channeled entirely into his intellectual and spiritual work. In 1268, his Italian period ended abruptly. The University of Paris was again embroiled in controversy over Aristotle, and the Dominican order needed their greatest theologian to return to the fight. Thomas was recalled to Paris for a second regency, the most difficult and combative period of his career. When Thomas returned to Paris in January 1269, he walked into a firestorm. The university was in crisis, torn between competing visions of how philosophy and theology should relate. On one side stood the conservatives, who wanted to ban Aristotle entirely and return to a purely Augustinian theology based on Plato and the Church Fathers. On the other side were the radical Aristotelians, led by Siger of Brabant, who pushed Aristotle's philosophy to conclusions that directly contradicted Christian doctrine. Seeger and his followers argued that philosophy and theology might reach different conclusions on fundamental questions, and both could be true. Reason, following Aristotle, might conclude that the world is eternal and that individual human souls are not immortal. Faith, following revelation, might hold the opposite. This was the theory of double truth, one truth for philosophy, another for theology. The position was philosophically untenable and theologically dangerous. If reason and faith contradicted each other, then either reason was useless for understanding divine truth, or revelation was unnecessary because reason could reach truth on its own. Either conclusion threatened the entire medieval synthesis that tried to hold together faith and reason. The church authorities were alarmed. In 1270, Bishop Stephen Tempier of Paris condemned 13 propositions associated with the radical Aristotelians. But the condemnation did not settle the deeper problem: how to use Aristotelian philosophy and theology without falling into error. Thomas had been working on this problem for his entire career, and now he entered the debate directly. In a series of short works written between 1269 and 1272, he attacked the radical Aristotelians, while also defending the legitimate use of philosophy and theology. In On the Unity of the Intellect Against the Averroists, Thomas dismantled one of Seeger's key positions. The Averroists, following the Islamic commentator Ibn Rushd, Averroes, argued that there was a single immortal intellect shared by all humans, rather than individual immortal souls. Thomas showed that this position was both bad philosophy, it contradicted Aristotle rightly understood, and heretical Christianity. Each human being has an individual immortal soul. Philosophy and faith agreed on this. The tone of this work was sharper than Thomas's usual writing. He called the Averroists' arguments not only contrary to the faith, but contrary to reason. He accused them of misunderstanding Aristotle. He challenged Seeger directly to respond to his arguments, rather than hiding behind the prestige of Averroes. But even while attacking the radicals, Thomas had to defend himself against the conservatives. Some theologians, including John Peckham, were arguing that Thomas himself was too Aristotelian, that his embrace of pagan philosophy was dangerous even if he avoided Seeger's errors. They wanted to return to a purely Augustinian theology based on Platonic philosophy and direct divine illumination of the mind. Thomas found himself fighting on two fronts. Against the radical Aristotelians, he insisted that reason and faith could not contradict because both came from God. Against the conservative Augustinians, he insisted that reason had its own legitimate domain, and could reach true knowledge of the natural world and even of God without direct divine illumination. The controversies were exhausting. Thomas was also carrying a full teaching load, continuing work on the Summa Theologiae, and producing shorter works on various topics. He commented on Job, on the Psalms, on the Gospel of John. He wrote treatises on specific theological questions: the eternity of the world, the power of God, spiritual creatures. The question of whether the world could have been created from eternity particularly occupied him during this period. Aristotle had argued that the world is eternal. The Bible clearly stated that God created the world in time. Could both be true? Thomas's answer was characteristically subtle. From reason alone, we cannot prove that the world had a beginning in time. The arguments for and against an eternal world are both inconclusive philosophically. But revelation tells us clearly that the world did begin. Therefore, we know by faith what reason cannot demonstrate either way. Philosophy cannot contradict theology on this point because philosophy simply cannot reach a definitive conclusion. This solution was too complex for the combatants on both sides. The conservatives thought Thomas was conceding too much to philosophy by admitting that reason alone couldn't prove creation in time. The radicals thought he was betraying philosophy by accepting revelation's answer. Thomas maintained that he was simply being honest about what reason could and couldn't accomplish. His second regency at Paris though intellectually productive, took a toll on his health. The constant controversies, the heavy teaching load, the endless writing, all of it was grinding him down. He was in his mid-40s now, and the years of intense mental labour were catching up with him. He complained occasionally of headaches and exhaustion. His fellow Dominicans noticed that he seemed more distracted than usual, more withdrawn. But he continued working on the Summa. The second part of the Summa Theologiae, treating human action, was his major project during these years. Here Thomas developed his moral theology with unprecedented systematic clarity. He analysed human action, showing how it proceeds from intellect and will. He examined the virtues, both the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. He discussed law in all its forms: eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. He treated sin and grace, showing how human beings, wounded by original sin but aided by divine grace, can nevertheless live virtuously and reach their ultimate end, which is the vision of God. This section of the Summa alone constitutes one of the most comprehensive moral philosophies ever written. Thomas addressed practical questions. Is it always wrong to lie? When is war just? What duties do we owe our parents? With the same rigour he brought to metaphysical speculation. Every article built on first principles, worked through objections, and reached conclusions that followed logically from the premises. In 1272, Thomas's second Parisian regency ended. The Dominican order, responding to Thomas's deteriorating health and the exhausting controversies, recalled him to Italy. He was assigned to establish a new Dominican house of studies in Naples, his hometown. At 47, Thomas returned to the city where he had first encountered the Dominicans almost 30 years before. He had come full circle. Thomas arrived in Naples in the fall of 1272, tasked with organising and teaching at the new Dominican studium. He was coming home not as the young student who had scandalised his family by joining the friars, but as the most distinguished theologian in Christendom, the man who had reconciled Aristotle and Christ. The studium was not a university but an advanced school for Dominican friars, preparing them for teaching and preaching. Thomas designed the curriculum himself, organised the library, and delivered daily lectures. But his primary focus remained the work that had consumed him for nearly a decade, the Summa Theologiae. He was writing the third part now, treating Christ, the sacraments, and the last things. This was the culmination of the entire project. After examining God and creation in the first part, and human action and morality in the second, Thomas now addressed the means of salvation, the incarnation, the redemptive work of Christ, and the sacraments through which grace flows to believers. His treatment of the incarnation showed his mature theological genius at its peak. How could Christ be both fully God and fully human? How could two natures, divine and human, exist in one person without either being diminished? Thomas worked through these questions with painstaking care, using Aristotelian concepts of substance and nature to clarify what previous theologians had stated but not fully explained. The sacraments, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing, ordination, marriage, received similarly thorough treatment. Each one was examined, its matter and form, its effects, who could administer it, who could receive it, what happened when it was validly performed. Thomas was not writing abstract theology, but providing practical guidance for priests who would administer these sacraments, and for believers who would receive them. His section on the Eucharist was particularly detailed. The doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, while retaining the appearances of bread and wine, had been formally defined at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. But how this could happen philosophically needed explanation. Thomas used Aristotle's distinction between substance and accidents to explain how the substance of bread could become the substance of Christ's body, while the accidents, taste, colour, texture, remained those of bread. It was a brilliant application of philosophical categories to illuminate theological mystery. But as he wrote through the spring and early winter of 1273, something was changing in Thomas. He seemed more withdrawn, more distracted. His attention wandered during community meals. He would sometimes stop in the middle of dictating, lost in thought, and his secretaries would have to prompt him gently to continue. On December 6, 1273, the feast of St. Nicholas, Thomas was celebrating Mass in the chapel of San Domenico Maggiore in Naples. Something happened during that Mass that his biographers describe as a profound mystical experience. The exact nature of it is unknown. Thomas never spoke of it directly, but witnesses reported that he emerged from the chapel visibly shaken, his face pale, his manner altered. After that day, Thomas stopped writing. His secretaries came as usual, ready to take dictation. Thomas sent them away. They urged him to continue. The Summa was nearly complete. Just a few more questions on the sacraments and the resurrection, and it would be finished. Thomas refused. His secretary and close friend, Reginald of Piperno, became increasingly concerned. He pleaded with Thomas to continue his work. The response he received has become one of the most famous statements in the history of Christian mysticism. "I can write no more," Thomas said. "I have seen things that make everything I have written seem like straw." Reginald was devastated. The great work, the comprehensive synthesis of Christian theology that had occupied Thomas for nearly a decade, would remain unfinished. But Thomas was unmovable. Whatever he had experienced in that December Mass had shifted something fundamental in his understanding. The arguments he had crafted with such care, the distinctions he had drawn with such precision, all of it suddenly seemed inadequate compared to what he had glimpsed. For 3 months, Thomas lived in silence. He continued his basic duties, celebrated Mass, prayed with the community. But the writing had stopped. The great engine of his intellect, which had produced millions of words explaining divine truth, had gone quiet. His family still lived in the region, and he visited them occasionally. His sister Theodora, the Countess of San Severino, lived not far from Naples. Despite the family's initial opposition to his Dominican vocation, they had reconciled over the years and were proud of his achievements. In early 1274, news arrived that would pull Thomas out of his silence, at least physically. Pope Gregory the Rex had called a general council of the Church to meet in Lyon, France. The purpose was to attempt reconciliation with the Greek Orthodox Church, which had been formally separated from Rome since 1054. The Pope wanted Thomas present at the council. His expertise on the theological differences between East and West, his reputation for careful reasoning, and his ability to address complex doctrinal questions made him an essential participant. Thomas agreed to go, though Reginald and others worried about his health. He was not well. The years of relentless intellectual labour, the poor diet and minimal sleep, the constant stress of controversy, all of it had taken a toll on his massive frame. He looked older than his 49 years, moved slowly, spoke little. In early February 1274, Thomas set out for Lyon with Reginald and a small group of companions. They would travel north through Italy, then across the Alps into France. It was winter, a difficult time for such a journey, but Thomas seemed determined to fulfill this final duty, to serve the Church one last time by participating in the work of reconciliation. They never made it to Lyon. Somewhere on the road in central Italy near the town of Menza, Thomas suffered some kind of medical crisis. The sources disagree on the exact symptoms. Some describe a fever, others mention him striking his head on a low-hanging branch. What is clear is that he became too ill to continue. His companions took him to the nearby Cistercian monastery of Fossanova, seeking shelter and hoping he would recover. The monks received them with honour, giving Thomas their best room and attending to him carefully. But it was apparent to everyone that the great theologian was dying. Thomas lingered at Fossanova for about a month, from early March into early April 1274. He was lucid for much of this time, able to speak with the monks and with Reginald. The abbot asked if Thomas would give lectures on the Song of Songs, a biblical book traditionally interpreted as an allegory of Christ's love for the Church. Despite his weakness, Thomas agreed and delivered several commentaries on the text from his sickbed. But he was fading. By early March, he was too weak to continue even these brief talks. He received the last sacraments, anointing of the sick and viaticum, the Eucharist given to those near death. The monks gathered around his bed to pray. According to the witnesses, Thomas maintained his calm and his faith to the end. He made his confession. He professed his belief in all the Church's teachings. He expressed his submission to the authority of the Roman Church. And he spoke briefly about his life's work, not with pride but with humility, asking forgiveness for any errors he might have written. On March 7th, 1274, early in the morning, Thomas Aquinas died. He was 49 years old. His secretary Reginald, who had been with him constantly during the final weeks, was at his bedside. The Cistercian monks who had cared for him during his last days witnessed his final breath. The death was peaceful, befitting a man who had spent his life seeking truth through calm, methodical reasoning. There were no dramatic last words recorded, no visions proclaimed. Thomas simply stopped breathing, as quietly as he had lived. The dumb ox, whose bellowing had indeed been heard throughout the world, was silent. The monks of Fossanova buried Thomas in their monastery church. They had cared for him in his dying days, and they considered it an honour to have his remains. But the body of the great theologian would not rest undisturbed. In the decades and centuries that followed, his bones would be moved, divided, and venerated as relics. His head was separated from his body and kept at different locations. Parts of his skeleton were distributed to Dominican houses across Europe. This medieval practice of dismembering holy bodies strikes modern sensibilities as ghoulish, but it reflected the belief that physical contact with the remains of saints could convey spiritual benefits. Thomas's contemporaries and successors considered him a saint even before his formal canonization. His holiness, they believed, sanctified even his bones. News of Thomas's death reached the Council of Lyon while it was still in session. Pope Gregory VI, who had summoned Thomas to attend, received the news with sorrow. The council had lost one of its most brilliant potential participants. The Church had lost its greatest theologian. But Thomas's death went almost unnoticed beyond ecclesiastical circles. He was known among scholars and church officials, but he was not a public figure in the way that Francis of Assisi or Dominic had been. He had written no popular devotional works, performed no public miracles, led no crusades or reform movements. He had simply taught and written, producing a body of work so technical and dense that only other scholars could fully appreciate it. The immediate reaction to his theology was mixed. The University of Paris, still embroiled in controversies over Aristotle, viewed some of Thomas's positions with suspicion. In 1277, just 3 years after his death, Bishop Stephen Tempier issued a sweeping condemnation of 219 philosophical and theological propositions. Several of these condemned propositions came from or were close to positions Thomas had held. The condemnation was aimed primarily at the radical Aristotelians, but Thomas's reputation suffered collateral damage. Some Franciscan theologians, including John Peckham, used the condemnation to attack Thomistic theology as dangerously rationalistic. They preferred the more traditional Augustinian approach that emphasized divine illumination over natural reason. For several decades it appeared that Thomas's synthesis might be rejected by the very church he had served. His works were read and used, but they were controversial. Some Dominican houses made his Summa Theologiae required reading for their students. Others preferred safer, more traditional texts, but gradually the tide turned. The Dominicans officially adopted Thomas's theology as the intellectual framework for their order. In 1309, the order declared that all Dominican students must study the works of Thomas Aquinas. In 1323, less than 50 years after his death, Pope John XXIII canonized Thomas as a saint. The canonization ceremony took place at Avignon, where the papacy was then located. The Pope praised Thomas not just for his personal holiness, but specifically for his theological works. His learning was declared to be as miraculous as any physical healing. His reconciliation of faith and reason was recognized as a gift to the Church. With canonization came increasing authority. Thomas's Summa began to be treated not just as one theological opinion among many, but as a definitive synthesis of Christian doctrine. Universities across Europe adopted it as a standard textbook. Commentaries on Thomas's works multiplied. Thomism became a school of thought, with devoted followers who developed and defended the master's positions. The Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563 in response to the Protestant Reformation, gave Thomas's work special honour. When the Council Fathers gathered to reform Catholic doctrine and practice, they placed two books on the altar of the council chamber, the Bible and the Summa Theologiae. This symbolic gesture indicated that Thomas's theology would guide the Catholic response to the challenges of the Reformation. In 1567, Pope Pius IV declared Thomas a doctor of the Church, one of the select group of theologians whose teaching was considered especially authoritative. In 1880, Pope Leo III issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris, which mandated that Thomas's philosophy and theology should be the basis of education in all Catholic seminaries and universities. Thomism became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. This official status lasted well into the 20th century. Until the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, every Catholic priest was trained into mystic theology and philosophy. Every Catholic philosopher learned to argue in the Thomistic style. The Summa Theologiae was translated into dozens of languages and studied in detail across the Catholic world. But Thomas's influence extended far beyond official Catholic education. His arguments for God's existence, particularly the famous 5 ways presented in the Summa, became the standard starting point for philosophical theology in the West. Whether one accepted them or rejected them, they had to be addressed. Every subsequent discussion of natural theology engaged with Thomas's formulations. His ethical philosophy profoundly shaped Western moral thinking. The concept of natural law, that certain moral principles are accessible to human reason and binding on all people regardless of their religious beliefs, became foundational to Western legal and political theory. When the American founders spoke of self-evident truths and inalienable rights, they were drawing on a tradition of natural law theory that Thomas had articulated. His epistemology, his theory of how we know what we know, influenced the development of modern philosophy. Thomas argued that knowledge begins with sensory experience but is not limited to it. The mind abstracts universal concepts from particular sensory experiences, allowing us to have genuine knowledge of the world. This moderate position, between radical empiricism and pure rationalism, helped shape the development of scientific method. Even those who rejected Thomas's conclusions often adopted his method. The careful statement of questions, the fair presentation of opposing views, the systematic development of arguments, the response to objections, this became the standard format for serious philosophical and theological discussion. The scholastic method that Thomas perfected remained the model for academic rigour for centuries. Protestant Reformation thinkers, though they rejected much of Thomas's theology, engaged seriously with his arguments. Martin Luther studied Thomas and reacted strongly against the Thomistic synthesis of faith and reason. Luther wanted to emphasize faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, rejecting the role that Thomas gave to natural reason and philosophy in theology. Yet even in rejecting Thomas, Luther was responding to him, defining Protestant theology in opposition to the Thomistic framework. In the modern period, Thomas's reputation went through cycles of neglect and revival. The Enlightenment, with its confidence in autonomous human reason, had little use for medieval theology. Voltaire and other philosophes mocked scholasticism as pedantic hair-splitting. The intricate arguments about the nature of angels or the number of persons in the Trinity seemed like absurd wastes of intellectual energy. But in the 19th century, Thomism experienced a dramatic revival. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris sparked a movement of neo-Thomism that produced brilliant scholars who applied Thomas's principles to modern questions. Jacques Maritain used Thomistic philosophy to address aesthetics and political philosophy. Etienne Gilson became the preeminent historian of medieval philosophy, showing that the medievals were not the Dark Ages, but a period of sophisticated intellectual achievement. In the 20th century, Thomas's influence could be found in unexpected places. The Catholic novelist Flannery O'Connor read Thomas and used his sacramental theology to inform her fiction. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, a student of Ludwig Wittgenstein, turned to Thomas's virtue ethics as an alternative to the utilitarian and deontological theories that dominated modern moral philosophy. Alistair MacIntyre's influential work After Virtue argued for a return to Aristotelian Thomistic ethics as a way out of the incoherence of modern moral discourse. Even in contemporary secular philosophy, Thomas's arguments continue to be engaged. The philosophy of religion as taught in modern universities still begins with Thomas's 5 ways for proving God's existence. Philosophers debate whether his arguments work, whether they can be reformulated in contemporary terms, whether the concept of God they arrive at is religiously adequate. But the debates themselves show Thomas's continuing relevance. In Catholic theology, the Second Vatican Council marked a shift away from the mandatory Thomism of the previous century. The Council encouraged engagement with modern philosophy and theology, opening the Church to a plurality of approaches. Yet Thomas remained influential. The Council documents frequently cite him, and subsequent papal documents, from John Paul II's Fides et Ratio to Benedict XV's various writings, continue to draw on Thomistic themes. Thomas's reconciliation of faith and reason remains his most enduring legacy. In an age when many see science and religion as implacable enemies, Thomas showed that serious intellectual engagement with both is possible. His conviction that truth is one, that what is true in philosophy must be compatible with what is true in theology, because both come from God, offers a framework for dialogue rather than warfare between different ways of knowing. His works have never gone out of print since the invention of printing. The Summa Theologiae has been continuously studied for 750 years. It has been translated into virtually every major language. Critical editions of his complete works, the Leonine edition begun in 1882, now run to more than 50 volumes and are still not complete. The sheer volume of commentary on Thomas is staggering. Thousands of books have been written about his thought. Specialized journals devoted to Thomistic studies publish hundreds of articles each year. International societies of Thomistic scholars hold regular conferences. 7 centuries after his death, Thomas Aquinas remains one of the most studied thinkers in human history. But beyond the academic industry that has grown up around his works, Thomas's fundamental insights continue to shape how many people think about the deepest questions. The conviction that reason can reach truth about God, the belief that the natural world reveals something of its creator, the insistence that morality is not arbitrary, but grounded in human nature and ultimately in divine wisdom. The assertion that we can know things about the world as it really is, not just about our own subjective experiences. These Thomistic themes remain live options in contemporary philosophy and theology. Thomas never sought fame or influence. He wanted only to understand and explain divine truth. He pursued this goal with methodical patience, brilliant insight, and profound humility. The massive body of work he left behind was not an attempt to demonstrate his own cleverness, but a labour of love, an offering to God and an aid to others seeking truth. The man who had once been called the dumb ox because of his silence produced one of the most voluminous bodies of philosophical and theological writing in history. The boy whose family had tried to prevent him from joining the Dominicans became the order's greatest intellectual ornament. The student whom others underestimated became the teacher whose influence would span centuries. And perhaps most remarkably, the thinker who had built the most comprehensive rational system for understanding God and creation ended his life saying that he had seen something that made all his writing seem like straw. Thomas never repudiated his life's work, but his final months suggest he understood that even the most brilliant human reasoning can only point toward mysteries that exceed our comprehension. We began this journey with an image of a man who stopped writing 3 months before his death, declaring that everything he had written was like straw compared to what he had seen. We end where we began, but with a fuller understanding of what those words meant. Thomas Aquinas spent his life building a cathedral of thought. Each argument was a stone carefully shaped and placed. Each question was a column supporting the structure above it. The whole edifice rose toward a single purpose, the contemplation of God. The Summa Theologiae, unfinished though it was, stands as one of the supreme achievements of human intellect. 2 million words, thousands of questions and articles, every major topic in Christian theology addressed with systematic rigour. It was an attempt to show that faith-seeking understanding could use every tool of human reason, logic, metaphysics, ethics, natural science, and find them all pointing toward divine truth. But on December 6, 1273, something happened that made Thomas see beyond the edifice he had constructed. Whether it was a vision, a mystical experience, an overwhelming sense of God's presence, or something else entirely, we cannot know. Thomas never described it. He only said that compared to what he had been shown, all his writing seemed like straw. This has sometimes been interpreted as Thomas rejecting his life's work, admitting that reason cannot reach God after all, conceding defeat to mysticism over scholasticism. But this reading misunderstands both Thomas and mysticism. Thomas did not say his work was false. He said it was inadequate, which is a different thing entirely. Straw is not useless. It has its purposes. It can be gathered into bundles and used for thatching roofs, feeding animals, or bedding. But compared to the ripened grain, the finished product, the bread that nourishes, straw is the discarded remainder. Thomas spent his life gathering and bundling straws of truth, organising them systematically, making them useful for others. What he glimpsed in those final months was the bread itself, the full reality toward which all his arguments had been pointing. The relationship between his life's work and his final silence is not contradiction, but completion. The arguments of the Summa were never meant to be substitutes for God, but signposts toward God. They did their job perfectly by leading Thomas to a point where he could receive what argument alone could never deliver. Direct encounter with the divine reality he had spent his life trying to understand. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Thomas Aquinas' life and work. Reason can take us far. Philosophy can clear away confusions, demolish bad arguments, show us what must be true. Theology can organize revelation systematically, answer questions, build comprehensive frameworks. But all of this is preparatory. The goal is not to understand everything about God, which is impossible for finite minds, but to know God directly, which is possible only through grace. Thomas's final months embody this paradox. The greatest master of rational theology fell silent because he had reached the limits of what reason could express. The man who could explain anything fell speechless before the reality that exceeded all explanation. Yet he didn't reject or abandon his earlier work. The Summa remained as his gift to the Church, useful for those still on the journey even though he himself had reached a destination where words failed. The grave at Fossanova didn't hold him long. In 1369, almost a century after his death, Thomas's remains were transferred to the Dominican church in Toulouse, France, where they remained for centuries. After various relocations during the French Revolution and its aftermath, his bones were returned to Toulouse, where they rest today in the Basilica of Saint-Cernin. His skull is kept separately in a reliquary at the Dominican church in the city. But Thomas's real presence is not in relics, but in the living tradition of thought he inspired. Every time a student in a Catholic seminary reads the Five Ways and tries to understand how we can know God exists through reason alone, Thomas is present. Every time a moral philosopher appeals to natural law to ground ethical claims, Thomas is present. Every time someone argues that faith and reason are compatible rather than contradictory, that science and religion can coexist, that Athens and Jerusalem have something to say to each other, Thomas is present. In classrooms and libraries, in theological debates and philosophy journals, in the quiet study of serious students seeking truth, the work continues. The questions Thomas raised are still being asked. The answers he proposed are still being refined, critiqued, defended, and developed. 750 years after his death, the conversation he started has not ended. The quiet boy from Roccasecca who asked, "What is God?" spent his life building an answer with every intellectual tool available to him. He showed that the question could be pursued rigorously, that reason was a gift to be used in service of faith, that the mind was not an enemy of the soul, but its ally. He demonstrated that one could be simultaneously a brilliant philosopher and a devout believer, that intellectual honesty and religious commitment were not incompatible. And when he finally stopped writing, he left behind not just millions of words, but a model of how to pursue truth with patience, humility, and confidence that truth ultimately comes from God and therefore cannot contradict itself. His epitaph could be taken from his own work, from one of the thousands of articles in the Summa. At the beginning of his very first question, does sacred doctrine require anything beyond philosophical sciences? Thomas writes that man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses our natural capacity to understand. We need to be instructed by divine revelation about things that exceed human reason. But this revelation does not make human reason useless. Rather, it perfects reason, guiding it toward truths it could not reach on its own, while using it to organize and explain what has been revealed. This is the core of Thomas's vision, the conviction that animated everything he wrote. We are creatures made by God, capable of knowing truth through our own powers, but directed toward an end that exceeds those powers, and therefore in need of both reason and revelation, philosophy and theology, the light of the mind and the light of faith. He lived this vision with complete integrity. The dumb ox became the teacher of the church. The kidnapped friar became the saint. The student who sat in silence became the master whose words would echo through centuries. If you have journeyed with me through this long night's exploration of Thomas Aquinas' life and thought, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear in the comments which aspect of Thomas's story resonated most with you. His childhood struggles, his years of study, his great works, or his final mystical silence. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Thomas Aquinas lies in Toulouse, his great works preserved in libraries across the world, his questions still being asked, his vision of faith and reason in harmony still beckoning to those who seek truth with humble hearts and rigorous minds. The Damok speaks still, his bellowing heard wherever human beings dare to ask the deepest questions and pursue them to the end. Good night.